Professor Heikki Patomaki, Miss Julie Geredien, Professor Ananta Kumar Giri, Professor Gyan Glui, Professor Mohanty, Minati Pradhan, and all friends co-present here. I welcome a very deep sense of gratitude to all of you to have with us today's Swadhyaya Chakra weekly dialogue. Swadhyaya Chakra is a creative dialogue. Today we are going to talk about a very creative book by Professor Patomaki. The title of the book is World Statehood, the Future of World Politics, which is a creative book, magnum opus. It deals with a very important issues of world history, governance, statehood, and also quest of sustainable development and environmental concern. Professor Heikki Patomaki is a professor of world politics. He's vice director of the Center of Excellence in Global Governance Research at the University of Helsinki, Finland, and is known for his continuous sadhana and work for human security, globalization, global institution, political economy, global security, so and so forth. I extend a very warm welcome to Professor Ananta Kumar Giri, Professor at Madras Development Institute, Miss Julie Geredien. She is a very creative writer, independent scholar, and organic intellectual. So thank you all of you for your kind participation in our Swadhyaya Chakra weekly dialogue. Swadhyaya Chakra is a circle of co-learning and mutual study, which is an initiative of studying and learning societies and the world. Friends associated with this institution are eager to work and mediate with new horizons of thinking and new movements of social cultural change at work in our contemporary world. We study seekers such as Maharishi Aurobindo, Mahatma Gandhi, Chittaranjan Das, a creative soul from Orissa, and many others around the world. We invite people from different fields of life to share their knowledge and praxis. Today we are very happy that Professor Heikki Patomaki has accepted our invitation to share his reflections on his very creative and transformative work on world statehood, the future of.
This is the starting point of the book, the basic problems that humanity is now encountering. And this is, of course, something that we are facing because of the Industrial Revolution and its consequences, including the fact that the world economy is now some 70 or 80 times bigger than it was at the time when the Napoleonic Wars ended in Europe. Is a huge development, and it has all kinds of consequences. We have now a planetary economy, and one of the problems that we are facing concerns economic instability and related phenomena, including also inequalities that I emphasize strongly in the book. Climate emergency is one of the consequences, and other ecological consequences belong to the same category, like the extinction crisis. We have also all kinds of pandemics that are also consequences of this economic growth, globalization, etc. And then there's this peace problematic, which is a very key theme of the book. in particular, the possibility of a nuclear war, but there are also other weapons of mass destruction. The human capacity to release huge amounts of energy in a very short time is behind the current situation in the 21st century, starting already in the 20th century, whereby humanity is actually facing an existential risk, and the future of the species is not anymore something that we can take for granted. And then, of course, we have also the possibility of various runaway technological developments, including artificial intelligence, nanotechnologies, and also the space expansionism has all kinds of consequences to the future of humanity as well. And our increasing dependence on the orbit of the planet also means that and also the electrical systems means that we are very vulnerable to also some cosmic events like massive solar storms or outbursts of space debris, destroying the possibility of using the orbit for any useful purposes. And this is very easy to do, destroy the orbit. Now, all these problems are very clearly global or planetary. However, the problem is that our political imagination remains captive of state sovereignty. This is actually a phrase that comes from the classics of international relations theory, particularly from Martin White, who wrote these words some 70, 80 years ago. But it is still true. And it is in some ways more true than it used to be 30 or 40 years ago, because of the new rise of nationalism and populism and authoritarianism across the world. So even though our fates are deeply interconnected, we are facing this situation where political imagination remains captive of state sovereignty. And the war in Ukraine is a case in point in one way. On the one hand, it exhibits this situation that we are facing, political imagination being captive of state sovereignty, etc. But at the same time, the war has re-raised the spectre of nuclear war that was very much part of our political scenery during the Cold War, but many people forgot it after the end of the Cold War. Can I have the next slide, please? So let me say something about the background of this idea of a world state, and I think this is a very telling statement that Thomas Weiss, who was at the time the International Studies Association president in 2009, when he wrote or asked what happened to the idea of a world government so central in the US to public debate in the 1930s and 1940s, and why has it been replaced by something called global governance? Well, this indicates that there has been a period in the past when the world state was actually discussed and debated very often in a very passionate way. And I will come back to that in a second. In fact, there was a similar period after the First World War in Europe already. And some people were, for instance, hoping that the League of Nations would be founded on a democratically elected world parliament rather than on representatives of states, which was an idea denounced and criticized very strongly by people like H.G. Wells at the time. Now, the idea, however, is still much older. It evolved from ancient cosmopolitanism. At that time, there was no institutional imagination to correspond to the idea. But after the scientific and political revolutions in Europe in the 18th century, the idea first emerged. And this has a background in all the changes that were happening at that time. I don't have time to explain them in any detail, but I mean, this was a combination of new cosmological imagination and the so-called explorations by the Europeans, which in practice were very often very exploitative and very often violent attempts to build colonial trading posts and then later imperial areas in various parts of the world, first in the so-called Americas and later in other places. But this also changed the vision of the world that was prevalent. in the heartland of these expansive systems. And this created new possibilities for thinking. At the same time, also the encounter with the others, including, for instance, in North America, the so-called Indians there, gave all kinds of ideas to the Europeans about how to reorganize things in a more democratic and equal or egalitarian way. And this combination led, including also with the rise of literacy in Europe and the so-called print capitalism, led to the rise of new sort of political imaginary. And that included also what many people call the peace interest. It didn't cover the entire world at that time, but it covered the heartland of the capitalist world economy and the state system. Can I have the next slide, please? So it was in this context that some Europeans started to play around with the ideas of League of Nations or even world state. The peace plan of Abbe de Saint-Pierre is quite well known, and it is very often taken as a kind of a starting point for the 18th century discussions about how to reorganize the system and create the basis for something that Immanuel Kant called perpetual peace. His essay by that name was published in 1795, and he argued for a federative union, but actually against the world state, which he thought would lead to first tyranny and then to another round of anarchical war against all. So he was quite skeptical about the idea of applying the notion of the state on a global scale or even on a European scale, but at the same time he was arguing for some kind of a federative union. Some others, however, and in particular anarchist Claude and then Karl Krause, were going further than Kant. And Claude is actually a particularly interesting case because he was a Prussian who became involved in the French Revolution. He actually acquired citizenship as well and was one of the leading figures of the French Revolution and gained a seat in the National Convention in 1792. And it was at that time that he started to argue for a world republic of humanity. So he thought that the idea of representative democracy and democratic government could be applied to the world as a whole. And he actually had a relatively detailed plan for the institutions of that kind of a world society. The National Assembly of the world would be sitting in Paris, but it would include deputies from everywhere, including Africa and what he called the Indies. These would include an executive council, or the institutions would include an executive council, 7 ministries, and elected by legislative assembly, and a president as well. Claude was one of those figures who actually fell victim to the revolution himself. He was executed by Robespierre in 1794, partly because he was not patriotic enough, but was actually suspiciously cosmopolitan. And this has been the fate of many of those who've been advocating radically cosmopolitan ideas since the 18th and 19th centuries. Karl Krause, however, died peacefully, and he didn't share this fate. He was a relatively obscure German philosopher, but he had some following in the Spanish-speaking world, and then also in Persia. And the Baha'u'llah, the Persian founder of the Baha'i faith, was probably influenced by the ideas of Karl Krause and developed similar ideas in Persia. And as we know, there's a worldwide movement advocating a world state based on the Baha'i faith even today. Can I have the next slide, please? Then there was a kind of a long gap. Very few texts would occur in the 19th century. There were ideas about world or even cosmic history or big history that were emerging in the 19th century, and some other cosmopolitan ideas. But very few we are actually thinking about the possibility of anything like a world state. But the idea re-emerged at the turn of the 20th century, and two books came, or were completed in 1902 at the beginning of the 20th century. And one was very interestingly by a Chinese Mandarin philosopher called 𝚒𝚗𝚎 and he wrote a book that is variously translated as the Book of Great Unity or the One World Book. I usually use the title The One World Book. And it was completed in 1902, but it was only published fully in the 1930s and translated into English in the 1950s. So it was not particularly well known at its own time, but later has played a role. 𝚒𝚗𝚎 was a very famous scholar in China. He was exiled or self-exiled for some time, and then he returned to China, and ultimately he died there also because of these political struggles. H.G. Wells, however, was a famous novelist already in the 1890s, and when he started to develop these new ideas, there was some kind of a turn in his thinking that he was very skeptical about the long-term cosmic developments, including in terms of the future of humanity. And the Darwinist evolution will lead to some pretty strange outcomes of really bad science and technology or some other form of destruction. But by 1902, he started to be more hopeful about the future, both of the humanity and cosmically as well. And then he gave to the Royal Academy a talk in 1902, and this became the basis of his bestseller, Anticipations of the Reaction of Mechanical and Scientific Progress upon Human Life and Thought. Nobody would have that kind of a title today. But anyway, so this was probably the first work in systematic future studies. And there he started to advocate a world republic, a world state. And this became his main preoccupation for the next 40 years until his death in 1946. And Wells developed this idea of a world state from a variety of angles and used different approaches. He was both writing about it in non-fiction and in fiction, and so he would deserve a lecture or two of his own. But I have to move on. So can I have this next slide, please? So I already mentioned that particularly the US, but in other places as well, there were debates in the 1930s and 1940s. Wells wrote, for instance, his famous book, The Shape of Things to Come, in the 1930s. That was also made into a film, and both were very popular. And he wrote also the Open Conspiracy, that was kind of a plan or almost like a blueprint for a world political party to establish a world state. The various versions, some of them are entitled, for instance, in a manner that it sounds very deep. What are we to do with our lives, for instance? And so there were different versions of the same story. But anyway, while Wells loomed large in the background of the discussions of the 1940s, many of these debates actually took place in the US. And during the Second World War in particular. And there were many advocates of the idea of world state, like Frederick Schumann, others who were opposed to it, like Reinhold Niebuhr, Hans Morgenthau was a famous political realist, and so on and so forth. But if you look at the text carefully, they all actually agreed that humanity is now at the turning point, and something like a world state will have to emerge sooner or later. And it was in that context that the World Federalist movement also became very strong in the US, and some people started to advocate it, including also Wendell Willkie, who was advocating strong and democratic supranational institutions, and Emery Reeves was another popularizer of the same idea. Wendell Willkie was a candidate for the US presidency in 1942, running against Roosevelt. And so he was a big national political figure at the time. Next slide, please. Now here's the standard argument of many of those so-called political realists who we are making arguments against some of whom they called idealists, charging them of naivety and hypocrisy. But all of them agreed that the world state has become essential to the survival of humanity. The technological developments, particularly the rise of nuclear weapons, is making a big difference, and something will have to change. Now, the problem is that there is no world political community. The world state requires a political community in which, to use the phrase of 𝚒𝚗𝚍𝚎𝚗𝚍𝚗𝚑𝚕, judgments converge. So obviously, when people come from different cultures or civilizations, if you like, and they have different frameworks of interpretation of world history and the current situation and the future, their judgments don't converge. And so there is no political community on a global scale. And that's the reason why you can't simply impose law and state-like institutions upon the world that is so diverse. And many of these thinkers thought that fairly simple arguments can show that there is a very long way to go before we have anything like a world political community. Now, so a world state is not possible in the foreseeable future, even though it is necessary in the longer run. So what they usually concluded with was something like, we need wise diplomacy, including avoidance of war, and functional cooperation across the world in order to create gradually the basis for something like a world state to emerge in the longer run. But meanwhile, we have to also take into account the real existing situation. And the case of Randhir is a case in point. In his The Children of Light and Children of Darkness, he summarized the problem as follows. The crisis of our age is undoubtedly due primarily to the fact that the requirements of technical civilization have outrun the limited order which national communities have achieved, while the resources of our civilization have not been adequate for the creation of political instruments of order wide enough to meet these requirements. So there's a discrepancy between the current technological capabilities of humanity and its political foundations. And this discrepancy was his main concern. And Niebuhr was quite interesting because he provided some kind of a processual account of how something like a world political community might actually evolve. So he was not simply opposed to attempts to create something like a world democratic order, but he tried to make some kind of a compromise between what he called the children of light and children of darkness, who we are very pessimistic about these possibilities. So children of light see universalism and globalization as providing an opportunity to create a world community, but they underestimate the power of particular forces of history. And he continued, the instruments of universality can be temporarily borrowed by the forces of particularity. And this creates tragic chapters of history. And this was the warning that many political realists were raising time and again, that there are false universalisms and they can actually lead to tragedies as easily as those particular forces of history that they might be opposing. And again, I would say that the war in Ukraine is a case in point, and that the Western liberalism and its universalism is encountering a very different interpretation of world history that is much more on the side of these particular forces and perhaps also children of darkness. But at the same time, I mean, this universalists can't see what it is that their principles actually do at the level of practical politics. Now, so we have to take that into account and thinking about the possibilities for anything like world statehood. That is a real consideration that we need to tackle. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the process is difficult and it is also complex. And this was also the point of people like Niebuhr. It is, he argued, not within the historical possibilities if we are thinking about the relatively short term, but in the long run, we need something like that. But he wanted also to create the basis of that not only through wise diplomacy and functional cooperation, but also by creating some democratic institutions on a global scale. Some sort of a system of checks and balances that would gradually create a basis for the rule of law on a global scale. And so that's one way of approaching this problematic. The context in which I wrote the book in the 2010s and 2020s is such that it is fair to say, in my opinion, that the debates about the world state have not progressed much beyond the debates of the 1930s and 1940s. There's this very well-known essay written by Alexander Wendt, and there are some other contributions that are discussed in the book. But there are all kinds of shortcomings in these discussions, and very often they only take a few steps into the right direction. I have adopted some ideas from this text, including the idea that you need to be very careful in specifying the tasks and functions of state-like entities or state-like functions and tasks. So instead of thinking about state as some kind of a given entity and a homogeneous whole or something like that, we think more specifically about the tasks and functions that have historically evolved and new tasks and functions that can also evolve in the future. But one of the things that is typically missing from many of these discussions about the world state is political economy. And this is a real concern, not least because some of the problems originate in world political economy, I mean, including those that are very often tackled by the discussions, people who are taking part in these discussions, but also more fundamentally because the combination of the separate states and their particular reasons, or the field of state reason, as I call it, and then the capitalist world economy that is global, which is liberal in the sense that capital can move freely from one place to another, and so on, and creates a discrepancy, but it creates also all kinds of instabilities and crisis tendencies and things or processes that tend to generate conflicts also among states. Can I have the next slide, please? And I'm talking about these integrative tendencies in global political economy. In fact, there's a 2018 book by the same name. It's also open access, so you can freely download it from the Routledge website if you want to see some of the details of the arguments. But the main point is that I'm very often here relying on post-Keynesian economic theory, widely conceived. In the world as a whole, there are all kinds of contradictions in the world economy that then are played out in the relations of states, and they very often involve what can be called the fallacy of composition, and this typically leads to a situation, to a contradictory situation where states aim to, for instance, improve their comparative position, but in fact what they do is counterfinal or counterproductive because the others are trying to do something similar simultaneously and thereby undermining the effort. A case in point is the attempt to run trade surpluses. If all the states, for instance, try to do that by way of internal devaluation or external devaluation for that matter, or some similar measures, and all of or they try to make their country more attractive to the international global capital by lowering taxes or worsening the work conditions. If everybody does the same simultaneously, none of them will be more competitive than the others or in a better position with regard to the capital, but all of them will have lower taxes, worse work conditions, and what also happens from a post-Keynesian economic theory point of view is that there will be a reduction in the aggregate efficient demand of the system. So everybody will be actually worse off. And this will feed into the conflicts between states without the state leaders actually necessarily realizing what is it that they are doing. So this is a further problem, and this then have all kinds of consequences within the states, including in terms of and through the feeding into the existential insecurities among the population, which very often generates then antagonistic identity politics, authoritarian nationalist populism, and related phenomena. Normatively speaking, once you realize that there's this kind of a situation, the normative conclusion is that there are rational reasons to create state-like functions on a global scale in order to counter these counterproductive tendencies and contradictions, tame the contradictions in the system. But at the same time, can I have the next slide, please? At the same time, the problem is also that you don't have those institutions to somehow overcome the problem. So, what can we say about the future of world politics from this perspective? On the one hand, there are many people who tend to believe that there's some kind of a pendulum of in world history that, for instance, when discussing the idea of Karl Polanyi about the double movement applied on a global scale, which is the topic of chapter 8 of my book, many people have been resorting to this idea that there's kind of a swing from markets to society building some kind of a system, state-based system to protect itself. And now this is happening on a global scale, and what we should be expecting is some kind of a global democratic welfare state or something along those lines. Yeah. Did someone say something? Okay, and the other thing is that but this is not happening. There's no automatic mechanism whereby this would be happening. And so that's one thing. But at the same time, I'm making this argument in the book that we can still make an argument about rational tendential directionality of world history. And there's the idea of rationality, but there are also some tendencies toward that direction. And ultimately, even though the tendencies can be analyzed in more detail in terms of different social forces, and particularly institutional constellations and processes that are ongoing, but ultimately, fundamentally, at the end, we have a learning process. And this is where not only rationality, but also the tendency itself lies. The learning process is constitutive of the underpinnings of these processes and fields that are generating the outcomes that we see as world history. And that can then lead to the idea of studying the world statehood or emergence of elements of world statehood from a process ontological point of view. And the starting point of the book is precisely this idea that the existence of a world state is not a categorical yes or no question, but rather we must specify the elements and functions that can be associated with stateness. This idea enables us also to pose the question, to what extent there already are elements of world statehood in existence, like certain rights or principles that are truly global and they can be seen even as constitutional. And for instance, I mean, some people claim that some human rights are constitutional in that sense. If you look at the trade treaties, private property rights seem to have similar the position in the current world economy, and some of the principles of trade that are related to property rights are similarly guaranteed almost as strongly, and in some cases even more strongly, than national constitutions. We also have various global institutions, etc. So we can, and we have things like global civil society, etc., etc. And so we can also pose this question about the existence of elements of world statehood in today's world. Secondly, we can pose questions about the process that leads to the emergence of these kinds of elements, and whether there's any inevitability involved in this process. And I will come back to that in a second. And then there are also questions like if these elements become more dominant in the future, as seems to be the rational tendential directionality or direction of history, whether a world state or these elements of world statehood can be sustainable. So even when you develop and build institutions like this, they don't necessarily mean there's some noise in the background. They don't necessarily mean that the outcome will be sustainable. So we have to take that into account as well. Now, the process metaphysics or process ontology thinks in terms of a dynamic world where I use also the concept of field quite often, less in this book than in this other book, Three Fields of Global Political Economy, but the arguments are fully compatible. But anyway, the processes are in this thinking more fundamental than things. Things are actually simply manifestations of a particular moment in these processes. They may look like solid things, but in fact they're the temporary expressions of these processes. And from this point of view, there are no unchanging essences. There are essences, but they are not unchanging. When an entity changes, its causal powers will change as well. Next slide, please. So this is the basic idea of the book, and it has several contradictory elements. I try to summarize many of those already. So first of all, there is a process of collective learning and and related actions, but they tend to be difficult in a world where political imagination remains captive of state sovereignty, and where we have asymmetric power relations, inequalities, and also all kinds of contradictory processes, including those understood in terms of these integrative tendencies in global political economy. We have also, because of those tendencies, the rising uncertainties and inequalities generating existential insecurity, leading to the process of securitization, the populist, nationalist, and xenophobic politics in many places. So it is in this context that we are making this argument. And the overall effect of all these ongoing changes, also with regard to the background of competencies, this is something I can't explain in any detail here, but it concerns the way we organize time and space in our thinking, but also our capacities, for instance, to read and tell stories and so on, which is related to many very fundamental and basic things of the things concerning our own existence. Now, the changes that are happening at that level are also ambiguous, and it is not clear whether they will give rise to the long view, which is required for this kind of politics, required by resolving common global problems, hollow reflexivity, and global imaginary. So So we are in a situation in the 21st century where some forces are pushing for worldwide integration and development of a world political community, but there are also very strong counter tendencies, and these are leading us to very different direction at the moment. The further problem is that there's certain circularity here, namely that the absence of the adequate common institutions is also a cause of what is happening in the global system at the moment. So the fact that these contradictory tendencies are playing out in this particular way is also because we don't have adequate institutions to guide these processes in a manner that would be sustainable. So, as you can see, the starting point of the book is deliberately quite ambiguous. Common institutions may even aggravate the problem of violence and war in some ways. And here I also have in the background the idea of Carl Deutsch concerning security community. No time to explain that in any more detail, but that's also an important part of the argument. While these common institutions are very much also part of the solution, or they can be. So any transformative actions would thus need to break this vicious circle. And this may happen in various ways. Through crisis and learning, which is the benign way, or through a global catastrophe, which is the less benign way. Next slide, please. Now, here comes the bigger argument, the deeper and more cosmic part of the argument that Ananta made references to. When thinking about the basis of anything like a world political community, there have to be some shared purposes, and therefore distinguishing between lower and higher order purposes and related identities. And the thing is that these higher order purposes can't determine the lower order purposes and identities, but they're nonetheless very important and provide the context for what I call cosmopolitical aspirations. So in the first part of the book, I actually explore the nature of cosmic and world history. And from that point of view, I try to make certain key arguments. One of them concerns the big history. And in chapter 2, I actually argue that the history of cosmopolitan thinking is closely related to particular cosmological imagination. But since the mid 19th century, some of the elements of what is now called big history have been developing, and this can be seen as a possible basis for something like a world political community at the level of higher order purposes. And therefore, in chapter 3, I systematically explore two different accounts of this big historical story about the emergence of new qualitatively distinct beings and complexity. And that has, especially on this planet Earth, which is our home. I use some pragmatist and critical realist philosophical ideas to make that argument. I also explore some of the theories of physics and cosmology in making this argument, showing that very often there's a lack of evidence, or that the evidence is pointing into a slightly different direction. So I don't question the idea that there's a cosmic history and cosmic process of evolution going on, but we don't know the beginning of this. And it seems that the story is much more about the emergence of new things and complexity than what has been the mainstream understanding based on the second law of thermodynamics. So the point here is, as Ananta already mentioned briefly, that this story that seems to me to be better grounded is actually capable of inducing also cosmic hopefulness and give us a context for thinking about world history as well. Next slide, please. Here we come to the point of reflexive futures and agency, I explore in particular in chapter 4 the idea of industrial revolution or different interpretations of industrial revolution. A lot of these discussions have been based on the idea that there was something particular about Europe that led to the industrial revolution in the 18th and early 19th century. Some people think that it might have started earlier. There's also a lot of confusion about the term itself. In fact, there have been processes of industrial production across the world many centuries, even thousands of years before the European Industrial Revolution. In fact, it was a mechanical revolution, not an industrial revolution. And it was the mechanical, the machines that we are using external sources of energy that made the difference. Now, in chapter 4, I argue that what happened in Europe was totally contingent, and it could have been otherwise. The Industrial Revolution could have taken place at another time in another place. I consider, for instance, the possibility of Han Dynasty, China, being the original location of the Industrial Revolution. There were other possibilities as well, and if somebody had succeeded in building an empire in Europe, it might have postponed the Industrial Revolution. It might have occurred somewhere a bit later, very likely in North America. There were other possibilities as well. Arabic world in the 13th, 14th century, it was perhaps 15th. I mean, the first steam engines were built there and so on. So it was very much another possibility. So I discussed these possibilities, but at the same time, I also make the argument that the Industrial Revolution itself was inevitable. It was not inevitable that it would happen in Europe, and in that particular time, but it was a result of collective learning of humanity, and it was bound to occur sooner or later somewhere. And it was also very likely to occur based on fossil fuels. So the problems of like global warming and etc., the industrial economic growth, extinction crisis, etc., would have been things that the humanity would have faced anyway, sooner or later. Very likely. And so the question is whether we are also capable of learning ethically and politically to respond to this situation. Now, the problem was also that this is another argument of chapter 4, that when these external sources of energy were developed, it also changed the nature of warfare as well. And it became an increasingly serious problem. Immanuel Kant, in fact, already anticipated the technological developments and increasing destructiveness of war. And the people like Wells anticipated the rise of nuclear weapons decades before they, in fact, were made for the first time. So Wells wrote in 1913 about a nuclear war in Europe in the mid-20th century. So all these are very much part of the argument about thinking about the world history as something where new things, qualitatively distinct things emerge, and new forms of complexity emerge as well. And that this generates new problems that then require some sort of response and resolution, which is part of the idea of rationality. But I also very much focus on the idea of reflexivity. I mean, awareness of these kinds of developments and situations, and capacity to monitor those kinds of developments and reflect upon them and make things, do things differently. And here the agency part of the story comes to the fore. Can I have the next slide, please? So this summarizes some of the key points that world history is part of the general story of increasing complexity and emerging powers. Now we have a new system, and I could delve into some of the details of those historical developments, but instead I will confine myself to just saying that what is important here is to rethink the relationship between inevitability and openness of world history. And this is precisely the dialectic basic dialectic of the book and its fundamental argument. That there are certain things, and when we are looking at things from a wide enough scales of time and space, that are inevitable in some sense. Not never totally unconditionally so, but in some sense we can make an argument. So for instance, industrial revolution was bound to happen, but I mean, had there been some kind of a cosmic accident, for instance, I mean, that might have prevented it from happening, etc. So it's never totally unconditional, but certain things can be inevitable in that sense if we allow for sufficient amount of time and space. But in the shorter run, many things are totally contingent and open-ended, and only some things are inevitable in that way. Many others are not. And I also make an argument that any rational tendential direction of world history is only a temporary telos or endpoint of history, nothing more. And there can be reasons to revise ideas about that kind of a telos in the course of history as well. Can I have the next slide, please? But anyway, as far as our current world historical situation is concerned, the rational tendential direction is toward absenting the absence of adequate common institutions. And so it is from this point of view that I try to develop the rest of the argument of the book. Much of it has to do with what I call the reflexive self-regulation of systems. That we have knowledge about how the systems function. In this case, we are talking about the whole world system of separate states and common world economy. And and we can reflect upon its possible futures from that point of view. But at the same time, in order to that kind of a knowledge to have some kind of an impact, we would need some institutional mechanisms. So we have the kind of a second order problem here. The first order is those institutions that are lacking that would be able to, for instance, guide some of the political economy processes into a more rational and more productive direction. But the second problem lies in the absence of those institutional mechanisms that can take this kind of learning into account when we try to reflexively regulate the system, self-regulate, because we are part of it. Now, so I theorize the process of this process of reflexive self-regulation and constructing institutions from a variety of perspectives. In chapter 7, from a post-Deutschian perspective, where I argue that the fixed identities and self-other relations and what Deutsch calls hard will are at the heart of the problem. And I try to solve the related puzzles with the help of the later social and political theories. It is in that context where I discuss, for instance, the virtuous circle of non-violence, and there are many other ideas there as well. Even there's an appendix on the role of religion. In chapter 8, I did explore the Polanyian double movement from that perspective. And here I argue, for instance, that because very often what we see are not very smooth developments. They are not linearly pointing to a particular direction. Many developments seem actually regressive and chaotic, and also collapses are possible as well. But from these, we can't conclude that there's no rational tendential direction of world history. And from this, I conclude, using also some global Keynesian and other ideas, ecological ideas included, that by creating better systems of governance and government, we can enable new processes of decommodification and new synthesis concerning the market social nexus. So in a way, contribute to something like the second movement in Polanyian double movement. Next slide, please. And then the argument in a way culminates in the chapter 9 of the second part, where I discuss the idea of a world political party. The agency itself can be located in various places: local, national, contextually limited, transnational, etc. And also the political possibilities that we try to enlarge, and the necessities that we try to emancipate ourselves from can be more local. But the way to do this is by way of having some sort of democratic control over the processes on a global scale, including through regulating, taxing, and shaping globally mobile capital. And this constitutes the rational tendential direction of world history at this particular world historical moment. Now, here comes the idea of world political party, that we might actually require something like a world party, democratic party, to further these kinds of processes, speed them up, guide them to a particular direction, etc. And in fact, there are many different possible roles depending on the world historical moment for such a party or such parties. We can talk about the activities within the confines of the institutions that we already have. Think about the IMF, the World Bank. I mean, this role of global civil society. World Party could do something similar. It can also take part in elections in a more limited context as well. It can advocate the transformation of global institutions and advocate the creation of new ones. And then it can, once those have been established, can participate in them. Obviously, if they are to be democratic, we need also political parties to take part in in different political processes, including through elections. So this is a key part, an important part of the process. And so I'm here talking about knowing how problematic the term is, global Keynesianism and holoreflexivity, and this is would be the task of world party or world parties at this moment in history. Next slide, please. And here we come finally to the final part of the book, where I try to summarize the idea of processual and open-ended account of world history, and then also discuss a few very concrete proposals to build new common institutions, and both two different levels. I mean, to tackle a concrete problem, and then also the second order level, where we would have a kind of a institutional mechanisms to take this learning about how the systems function into account. So in chapter 10, I criticize some of the earlier development discussions about the world state, and then provide a processual alternative, including in terms of this wider agenda that includes the consequences on uneven economic growth, contradictions of the world economy, ecological crises, and new problems that have been created, for instance, because of space expansionism. In chapter 11, I develop with Johan Wallsten and Jamie Morgan the idea of a global greenhouse gas tax, which would be a very far-reaching way of tackling global warming, and also creating major global resources for various purposes of public economic policy on a global scale. And this would be extremely important from the point of view of responding to the situation of global heating and its consequences to many parts of the world, both for to try to mitigate the problem, and also to do something about the consequences for hundreds of millions of people around the world, what the global heating is going to generate. The proposal is to create not only a global fund, but a new democratically organized and inclusive global organization. Also non-democratic states, however defined, can participate, but not necessarily in the democratic assembly of the organization. It's a complex argument, but the idea is to concretize in a very important context the idea of particular functions and tasks of something like world state or elements of world statehood, to be more precise. And the next slide, please. And then in chapter 12, I discussed the idea of a world parliament. It is an attempt to rethink the idea of this chapter is an attempt to rethink the idea of a world parliament from a new angle. So typically there have been two possibilities. Either we see the parliament as a place to talk only, a kind of a symbolic representation and nothing more, or alternatively a sovereign legislative body. Here I propose something different. That on the one hand, it would be the body that coordinates the activities of different functional democratic systems of governance. But on the other hand, it also would respond to the indeterminacy of the systems of international law by serving as some kind of a democratically elected Supreme Court of the world. And that would be able to determine what the already existing international law is. At the same time, a world parliament would also speak in the name of the world community, in the name of humanity, and thus respond, among many other things, to the questions raised by space expansionism and the rise of related capabilities, to just give you one important example. So who is to decide, for instance, whether how we should respond to the existence of alien forms of life? Think about microbial life that could pose a major threat to the humanity if somebody brought that on planet Earth. And then the next slide, please. The final part of the argument concerns the beyond world statehood. And here in the final chapter, I return to the larger timescales of part one, and I try to think about the future. Imagine a world where this the layer of world statehood will never be the only layer. There will be many other layers, and the existing states and political communities will continue to exist as lower order entities of various kinds for a long time to come. But the level of the layer of world statehood can become more dominant over time. Imagine that kind of a world. Would that be sustainable or not? Well, that is the question that I explore in chapter 13. And then I actually go deeper into some of the questions about building a global civilization. What is its political imaginary? What kinds of symbols, what kinds of ways of thinking, and what levels, what kinds of forms of ethical and political reasoning can be prevalent in that kind of a world? And while I argue that we can have a world political community of that sort, it is actually quite vulnerable to all kinds of possible conflicts within it. So at the end, I have three scenarios of the possible processes of disintegration of that kind of a system, complex system where world statehood is pretty dominant. And the final one of them is actually the idea of it is to be a self-denying prophecy. By showing what can happen, the argument is that we never should do anything like that because the future of humanity is extremely important. The next slide, please. So this is in sum the idea of the book. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Heikki Patomaki. It was really a very enriching session and very, very thought-provoking session. We thought about the idea of another world is possible. Your book is a kind of invitation for all of us to engage with that transformative idea. And what a beautiful, insightful presentation you just had. It is a kind of calling for all of us to read your book and have a discussion on the very important ideas. And yes, we are facing a kind of crisis where there is a calling of global governance. So now I request Ms. Julie Geredien to share some of her reflections.
And for your book, I was able to read several of the chapters that you did send, and there's so much more information that you provided as overview in this presentation. I think what I will do is focus on 3 main points that you made in this presentation. One has to do with that issue of the counter forces and how important it is for us to be recognizing the nature of these counter forces. Secondly, the point that you make about the World Parliament needing to be able to respond to indeterminacy and the nature of these indeterminate factors, which include even, cosmic impacts on the planet, things much greater than any one nation, and perhaps not even of this earth. And finally, this understanding, which I think is related to what I'm going to be saying about how to respond to indeterminacy, the dialectic between the community and the institution, and how might institutions evolve in a way that is in a dialogical relationship with community. How is this possible? And what kinds of things have you said about it already? So to start with the counter forces, first of all, I think it's interesting as a Baha'i myself, in the tablets to the Hague that Abdul Baha wrote in 1919 and presented to that Central Organization for Peace, he really lay emphasis on the need to recognize these 2 kinds of forces, an integrative force and disintegrative force. Now, what I think is interesting is this concept that Luz Irigaray reminds us of in her writing, of heteros, this Greek concept of opposites, really, what is truly other or different. And how might the other or what is different nevertheless abide in a relationship of sensitivity, the kind of sensitivity that one finds in a relationship with another body. Now, for Baha'is, we have this metaphor of the wings of a bird. For instance, science and religion are the wings of one bird. So it's actually a kind of understanding of functionality that is accessed through these metaphors of life, of living bodies. The tree is another one, the blossoms and leaves of trees. Now, there's, of course, this issue in ethics and morality of, what is other or different that we morally oppose, cannot be reconciled. The fire and ice in one heart, cannot abide together. But what I find is really compelling about what you offer here is a way of thinking in terms of temporal processes and telos. And this, I think, really goes to your idea of holoreflexivity, that there may be a way for us to recognize people's desires and motives in a more temporal framework that helps us to position them organizationally in a way that then responds more to what is intelligible to us as a cooperative, life-affirming, path through which all life on the planet, and especially humanity as a living organism in and of itself, can truly thrive and cooperate and be peaceful and prosperous. So I was very interested in that way of thinking in terms of process and time frames, that how can we reframe our thinking about human self-interest and then reorganize according to that. Now, Richard Levins, who was a professor of public health at Harvard University and involved in the revitalization of the science movement, he personally found that understanding complexity through these kinds of time frames was very helpful in understanding interrelationships. For instance, life within, let's say, a lake or a pond. There are all different kinds of organisms that have different lifespans, different temporal realities. You know, how quickly some of these elements at the very elemental level regenerate. They're being born and die in a moment. And they're interrelating with all these other kinds of organisms with different time frames. Now, the ways that humans interact then with the lake, or that whole ecosystem, is a whole other time frame and has a whole other responsibility or accountability to those other forms of life. So I just found that it very intriguing ways of sort of perhaps drawing some other disciplines into your understanding of holoreflexivity and this understanding of process and ontologies associated with that. Now, for this second topic that I was intrigued by, about the importance of us understanding the interdeterminacy, the need to respond to interdeterminacy is basically shaping how we even conceive of a world parliament. And here is where I thought your concept of transformative praxis was really helpful. If we can think in terms of the relationship of agency to structure and what can feasibly emerge out of that relationship. Now, to me, what this signals is a need to transform our social structures so that they can reasonably respond to indeterminacy. So this would imply a movement from static social structures in which hierarchies and social roles and even the nature of learning, for instance, within one kind of discipline or kind of epistemology, is radically liberated. And the structures become dynamic, meaning that people's potentials can evolve dynamically. They can exist in different kinds of social relationships within, a community, rather than holding, for instance, one position as the executive chief, decision maker, right? These all could be much more dynamic. Now, some of structures that may be able to do this are participatory action research, for example, and other structures might include community making structures that allow people to find ontologies that truly support trust in relationships, and what in different traditions have been called covenant, the realities of covenant, which in my understanding have to do with principles of reciprocity and cooperation. These structures, I think, are not something that you talk about directly, but I do think that I think it's your chapter 12, where you're talking about the carbon taxes and carbon trading and different kinds of reforms and the kinds of problems that emerge from that. You bring up an issue like carbon leakage, which is an outsourcing of these, you're making a trade and then they're outsourcing because the cost is too high here. So, basically they're behaving unethically. Well, in a static social structure, that those kinds of motivations are likely simply to replay themselves. In a far more dynamic one, where, for instance, the realities of people who exist within border regions, and here I mean literally border regions between nation states geopolitically, but all kinds of other border regions where people abide, where they are not socially integrated within community life in different ways. Their voice is not heard, their perspective is not understood, and their histories are not taken into account. And, as just, reading your account of these histories and the nature of the global political economy, I see, well, where is someone drawing attention to the relationship of the slave plantation to the global corporation? These kinds of histories are part of what can help us to integrate border thinking, border ways of knowing into these kinds of dilemmas that are much more transformative if they can really be included more holistically. Here, I also think of Theresa Brennan's work. She was an Australian philosopher and neuroendocrinologist, a psychologist, and the way she approached social dilemma. She has a book, Terrors of Globalization, where she deals directly with the issue of outsourcing, and she looks at it as a replacement of space with time, rather than allowing time for restorative processes, whether they be human resources or natural resources. People outsource to a different region and replace that. Now, my point here about the dynamic social structures is that that replacement is also a replacement that occurs within the human psyche. If we do not have time to regenerate the kind of imagination that you're speaking of, which you say is held captive by the state sovereignty, and it certainly is being encroached upon. Betsy Taylor has a term for this, I believe, called mind space matter. In other words, a kind of overtaking of the imagination. The default network is just, overwhelmed. People cannot actually perceive and imagine and participate in the life systems, what I was speaking about in that lake or pond, and all those complexities and dynamisms. So this is where I really feel that the emphasis on the dynamic social structure in order to relate to those indeterminacies is so key to understanding what this World Parliament, is called to do. And finally, the dialectic between community and institution. Now, Randhir, I do have a little bit of a PowerPoint. I have some notes. I don't know whether it's possible to share that now.
I request you to please share on my email ID.
Share
on my email ID. I will send a message on your email ID.
Okay, yes. Okay, one moment. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm looking for an email from you.
Okay.
Would you like me to email?
Yes. Meanwhile, we can invite Dr. Omen from Denmark to share some of his reflections. Meanwhile, I will connect you through email.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Omen.
Yeah, this is Osman Farah. Thank you very much, Randhir, Dr. Randhir, and Professor Ananta, for inviting us these illuminous such intellectual sessions that we get from you sometimes. And I really appreciate Professor Heikki Patomaki's presentation, and also sharing with us his chapters. It is really, in the current world around, it is really difficult to get some optimistic take of what is going on in the world. So I commend the professor of trying to get us of these difficulties the world is facing. As I read the materials that were sent, is that Professor Heikki is suggesting we are at crossroads. We are actually at crossroads, that we need to decide very soon on how we should move forward. It can go two ways. One way, it is we continue the status quo, and we continue how the world is deteriorating, and how the suffering and cruelty and so many other challenges are taking place within prevailing statehood, kind of a statehood system that was implemented during the end of the Second World War. Because we know the current world system is actually created from Westphalian to the Second World War, and it is downloaded by other societies. It is downloaded by Africans, by Asians. So the current system that prevails the world is actually more or less historical, and it's also Western. We have to admit that. So we are at that crossroad. Either we go to the real end of history, not that Fukuyama thing, but now it is actually very serious. As Professor Heikki has also written, it is catastrophic, and it is ecliptic, something like that. It can be very, very, very serious this time. Or, as Professor Heikki and other scholars have proposed it, we can pursue some kind of process-oriented, procedural, rational, thinking, curious approach on solving global problems through statehood. This is how I understood the state systems. I think these are two options in my superficial understanding that Professor Heikki has understood. But as I agree with Julia. The professor has expanded, but I need time to digest what the professor has said now, and then probably another time I can comment. But I believe that what the professor said is in line with other other critics have said. For instance, Jürgen Habermas, during the pandemic, we had a very serious pandemic that provided the world with an opportunity. You remember the virus, the pandemic, the whole world was standstill. It was actually one of the first opportunities. I don't know what is the first. The world had to stand and reflect what is going on, because the whole world was almost sick, and there were lockdowns, and we were all locked in our rooms and so on. And it was from south to north, from east to. So that opportunity probably is missed. Professor Habermas says at that time we didn't have health crisis. His core argument is it was not a health crisis. It was an epistemological crisis. He calls it was an epistemological crisis because he observed that scientists, prominent medical scientists, actually had thousands of versions on how to overcome the virus. They didn't agree on how to medicate, how to solve the problem. So they could not actually solve the problem, and they disagreed also with the politicians. Politicians on the market, they had their own approach of the virus, and he said this was a very epistemological crisis that we need to solve collectively. But as I followed up what Professor Habermas said, not much people have followed up his proposal. So that is a problem. I think Professor Heikki's argument is also in line with other critical scholars. For example, Chomsky and colleagues have proposed some time ago with different kind of books and articles where they write, who owns the world? Who owns the world? There was a title that says, who owns the world? And it's actually these scholars, Chomsky and others, they provide the answer where they said, according to our analysis, the world is owned by 6 major companies, most of them Americans, and they actually command the economic production, they command the cultural production, they command social, many other productions. So these are in charge. These are the critical scholars' argument. But I personally think, together with many others, that humanity doesn't own the world. They inherited the world. They inherited the world, and they might probably, in temporary times, responsible of it. They are responsible to sustain it and to take care of it, but they don't own it. They don't own the world. And there is a lot of proof that they don't own the world, because most of the people who 100 years ago who insisted they own the world, they are not with us now. They are actually in the earth. The earth owns them. the earth. They are buried. They are buried in the earth. The people who 100 years ago insisted they own the world. So humanity cannot own the world. They can share the world, and they can actually take responsibility of it. So that is what is happening. And I don't know whether you know scholars who studied transnational governance, Thomas Riese, for example, and others. They also conclude with there is interesting scholarship called limited statehood. Limited statehood. Although the state, as Professor Heikki and others also propose, are dominant, they are not actually doing much in this world. There is a limited statehood. They are in major cities. For example, if you go to a country like Denmark or Finland or Germany or United States, the state is in and around the cities. They are not in the interior. They are not in the interior of the country. So another thing is, states actually, as they are today, they are not solving problems. They are not solving global problems. Professor Thomas Pogge at Yale University and others have studied that most of the problems of the world are solved by global civil society. For example, if you take the people who are dying in the Mediterranean Sea, migrants, the people who are dying in the Pacific, in the Atlantic Ocean, the people who are suffering from different places, the people who cannot be vaccinated, the people who cannot be mothers, who cannot be helped, children who cannot be saved. It is not the state who are very busy to save these people. It is actually ordinary people. Even the fires in Canada and in the United States, in other places, the state comes later on. President Biden was in Hawaii 20 days later, something like that. So the state is actually reactive. It's not proactive. The state is not solving many of these problems. So the current state is actually not passive. They might trying to monopolize power and do many things, but they are not the rescuers of this world. We have to admit that. So we need some kind of responsibility. And I don't need to take much of your time, but I think I partially agree that dialectics, we need to do something. The dialectics of violence, monopolization of violence, and so on structures and bureaucratization on one hand, and the aspect of recognition and respect and human inclusion. Professor Heikki has explained that. I agree that dialectics is very important. But what I will suggest is we need to move on toward balancing. I think we need to contextualize it. We need to contextualize and balance some kind of, say, who is doing what, when, and where, According to my analysis, most of the people who are suffering in this world are in the south, and most of the people who are actually also suffering but also having a good time are in the north. So there is some kind of north south asymmetric, and there are also other country structures who are trying to do something about it. I don't know whether you have been following the gathering in South Africa, China, and so on, but China and many other countries, they are part of the dominant structure as well. Yesterday, for example, the Chinese in South Africa, they proposed that we have to continue the dominance of dollar as an exchange currency. It is the Chinese who are proposing it. So even the Chinese, they don't want to deal with the dominant structure. They want to be part of the dominant structure, and that is a problem. I think we need to do some kind of responsibility, and we need to. I agree. We need some kind of epistemological balance in this world. What is going? What is happening? And we have to deal with that. Finally, I think Professor Heikki has also mentioned the issue of master-slave relationship. This is very classical. Hegel spoke it, and many scholars spoke it, and it is continuing, because if you see the world, I am from transnational community. I'm one of those communities who move around the world and see the contradictories of the current statehood. So master-slave relationship exists actually through the dialectics of north-south relationships. The north actually is dominant, and you can also consider it as the masters, and the south is struggling to overcome that. So that relationship is intact in many ways, and we need to get rid of it. I want to conclude an anecdote. I think Julia was partially mentioning this kind of counter. I think Dr. Julia's proposal was very interesting. This kind of counter. I'm also interested how to counter the dominance that prevails. There is a classical anecdote. I don't know, some of you remember it. A very cruel king actually decides to recognize his slave and to respect and so on. And then he called his slave and said that from that day, I will never be cruel against you, the king declares. And then after a short while silence, the slave says, that is fine, I have been suffering, but from that day you declared you will not be cruel to me. That day I will also stop spitting your food, the food you eat, the food the king eats. So that tells us oppression and monopolization has limitations. You cannot monopolize and oppress people forever. And this also is related to the structure of laws. Laws are okay, but laws are actually limited. Laws are limited procedures to overcome challenges. We can explore a dialogical approach. We can explore other ways of coming into contact with each other rather than the laws, because the current laws of the world, they work for the people who are powerful, people like Trump, people who have big organizations. So the laws of the current world are not laws. They are very biased laws. If they are laws, they will have rescued people, and then they will have limited wars and cruelty and so on. Finally, I am not romanticizing, but I think the world needs some kind of violence, but they need violence against the people who brutalize the world. So we cannot eliminate violence. If we want to use violence, we have to use it against those people who are eliminating people who are destroying the world. But at the moment, we are using the laws and monopolization against people who are already suffering. Thank you very much. And then I will give you one final example of the contradictory of laws. Here in Denmark, in Finland, in Germany, actually there are laws, but they don't apply equally. The laws, if you are an immigrant, a refugee, or if you are poor, there are laws that apply to them. And if you are wealthy and powerful and are from the universities and from structures, then there are other laws. So laws, even in well-functioning democracies like Scandinavia, the laws are not equal. People are not treated equally. There are laws for women, and there are laws for men. There are laws for immigrants, and there are laws for people who are not immigrants, and so on. So laws we cannot just take as what you call. We need to be critical toward the formulation of laws and who is formulating it and for what purposes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very well said. Thank you. Now I request Ms. Julie to complete her presentation.
Other person who is going to be speaking, what is the limitation?
No, we have 10 more minutes to go.
Is there anyone else who was to speak? There's enough time for me to do this?
No. Yes, you have enough time. You have 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, in response to our friend who has just spoken about the nature of the laws, what I'm going to say, I think, has to do with this transformation of an understanding of the rule of law to that of the rule of wisdom. And this would be a much more responsive way of relating to self-regulation. I think that is another theme that comes out strongly in your work, Heikki. I was going to say about this dialectic of community and institution. Is it possible to share the slides here, just the first ones that I have prepared? That I sent by email?
Yes. You have to send by email.
Okay, I did do that. Is that not there? It's all right. If not, then I will not. Okay, should I send again to, well, I don't, let's see. Perhaps what I sent just went to Ananta and not, okay. Okay. In the meantime, to go back to Abdul, is it?
In the meantime, we can invite Professor Heikki. Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, Professor Heikki.
I saw more like reflections upon the themes that I was discussing than direct criticism of anything that I said. So I think there is plenty of agreement among us. I think I entirely agree with Abdul Qadir that there's what I said is there is certain resonance with Habermas, for instance. I mean, I to a certain degree at least rely on his idea of discourse ethics in the book. So that's part of it. But I don't think that the Habermas's institutional imagination concerning the way the world system can be organized or should be organized is very developed. I mean, he has been much more focused on European politics and European institutions and much less on the global scale. So that is a problem. So he has some useful concepts like world domestic economic policy, for instance, which I think is a great notion. There are also certain affinities with Chomsky, and the question who owns the world property rights is extremely important also for my argument. Inequalities play a very important role. When we are talking about, and Julian was also talking about the biases of law, and I think this is a kind of a key issue. This comes very close to the idea of global democracy that I discuss in the book. And the whole idea is to actually to have everyone on the planet as equal citizens. I mean, that's the ultimate ideal. And it also requires redistributive possibilities on a global scale. For that purposes, we need a number of institutions, including global taxes. And so that's the reason why I discuss global greenhouse gas tax there. And we need also some other ideas. I mean, I mentioned in the book, but I don't develop this idea of international clearing union, which involves also a world central bank, and the issuance of money is also a key source of resource. And it is possible to have world central bank currency and then use that for common purposes on a global scale. For instance, mitigation of extreme poverty in the world, also to tackle the consequences of global warming in different parts of the world. Think about the whole of Africa, for instance, and for many other purposes as well. We need also global public investment programs for the green transition, but also for the welfare of people across the planet, and also for the rational economic policy on a global scale. So all these are required. But on top of that, the idea of world parliament and the idea of overcoming the indeterminacy of international law by those kinds of means is basically means that whereas at the moment there are a couple of states, particularly the United States and the UK, who've been speaking on behalf of the world community, claiming that they are the international community, it is possible to have a democratically elected body that can actually legitimately speak on behalf of the humanity as a whole. And I think that would be a major step also for determining what the law actually is, and also a way to make it much less biased. I mean, there's no way we can eliminate all the biases of the world. The critical project will continue no matter what. But we can improve the current situation in a dramatic fashion, I think, by way of establishing something like a world parliament.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Very well said. Very well said. Now I request Julie Geredien to share her presentation.
Thank you. I think with the amount of time that we have, perhaps I'll just go to those very closing slides. Are there going to be more words? I see there are 5 minutes left.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So I'm just saying.
Will you be directing the slides from your end there, Randhir?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Sorry.
So the last slide you want to talk about?
I think just the very closing ones, I mean, we could go, or I just don't think I'll get through all of what I have in the amount of time that we have remaining. So I don't know whether to begin or not to begin. It's sort of, but the very end, I have some quotations that I think just may be helpful in terms of that relationship, the master-slave relationship. How are we to return to this understanding that I find in the Baha'i writings? Baha'u'llah says, "Know ye not that we have created you all from the same stock, from the same dust, that none of ye should exalt one over the other." In this tablet that Abdul Baha presented to The Hague, there are actually 2, and you can find more out about this in a book called A World Without War. Abdul Baha, and I think it's like his contribution to peace discourse. This is authored by Janet Khan and Professor Hoda Mahmoudi, who is the chair of Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland. In this tablet, which the authors write about, you find explanations of Abdul Baha's contribution to this history, which is referred to the history of world governance, world statehood, how this has developed. You see some of his analysis of his contributions. Not many know that not many remember now at this point, Abdul Baha's journey across the Americas, throughout Europe and parts of the Middle East, speaking on peace, the promulgation of universal peace. And in this tablet, he reminds of the teachings of Baha'u'llah, their universal application, that the word of God, the understanding of the prophets, the kinds of visionary knowledges that great indigenous spiritual leaders have offered to humanity, that we find, for instance, in the 16 sacred principles for creating a sustainable and harmonious future, which we find evolving out of the Indigenous Global Wisdom Summit. These great teachers and prophets and leaders and sages for humanity are what offer us the great remedy for our ills. It is through communing and comprehending their wisdom that we will be able to communicate across these borders and boundaries, that we will find a shared language together. And he says, at present, universal peace is a matter of great importance, but unity of conscience is essential, so that the foundation of this matter may become secure, its establishment firm, and its edifice strong. And this is what I think is so important in this movement from the rule of law to the rule of wisdom, that we no longer think in terms of unity as merely agreement to law, consent, and then of course all these other kinds of machinations that then go on at this other level. As you point out, the higher purpose does not necessarily influence, lower one. We have to think in terms of dialogue and dialectic. And finally, related to all of this understanding of unity of conscience is this understanding of trustworthiness, being the greatest portal leading unto the security and tranquility of the people. In truth, the stability of every affair hath depended and doth depend upon it. All the domains of power, of grandeur, and of wealth are illumined by its light. This is from the tablets of Baha'u'llah. And I think when we reposition our concerns towards this development of trustworthiness, we can see in our social structures and in the kinds of sources of knowledge and understanding and wisdom we turn to, the need to prioritize in our development this portal of becoming trustworthy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Now I request Minati Pradhan to share some of her reflection and offer vote of thanks.
Thank you so much. Whether we have time, just to, I have one query. Whether we have time?
Yes, we have 5 minutes.
Thank you. First, I would like to congratulate Professor Heikki Patomaki for that very wonderful book. And thank you so much for this very enlightening presentation and very detailed presentation. I have just a small query. In the chapter 3, when we're describing that we are in this increasing complexities can be dealt by the philosophical ideas and theory of cosmology. So would you like to put a little more light about this, how this will really work? So then I can share more of thanks. Thank you.
Something about theory of cosmology? Yeah.
Hello?
Yes, Professor. Yes.
Hello? Am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are audible.
Yeah,
I was just asking, yes, I mean, how it can be dealt with the philosophical ideas and the theory of cosmology. So I just want to know a little more about it. Thank you.
I'm very happy to give an entire presentation of it. It's a very long and complex argument. The basic idea is that there are two different accounts that are both compatible with modern science. The first is tends to be atomistic, reductionist, and some of the stories about the origins of the universe are based on that idea. It's also a Darwinism writ large on a cosmic scale. So, for instance, the idea that there are multiple universes, actually countless number of universes existing simultaneously, and our universe only just happens to be such where life is possible. But there's some kind of a background. I wouldn't dare to call it space, but some kind of a background form of existence within which new universes are constantly emerging. And in fact, one of the implications of that multiple universes theory is that there's also another universe that is exactly the copy of ours. And so simultaneously with that story, there's other line. It's directed toward the death. There's the heat death of the universe at the end. There's also the expansion of space. The lower level, I mean, the solar system will be habitable only so long. There are other cosmic catastrophes, and we are very likely to destroy ourselves in the coming century. So as you can see, I mean, the one account of the scientific story about the Big Bang and the cosmic evolution is highly skeptical about the possibilities for anything really hopeful to occur on a cosmic scale or for the humanity in the future. In fact, we are doomed, more or less, and in that story. And that's also a scientific story, and it's quite prevalent at the moment, and I actually associate it with a particular social formation. So it is an ideology that is very closely connected with the contemporary world system, and particularly the liberal capitalist economic system, and also the system of sovereign states. The other story is much more life-oriented. The idea is that there's only one universe at the time. The basic the constants of the laws of physics, etc. I mean, the basic structure of the universe that makes this very life-friendly, this universe, actually originates in the before of the Big Bang, or what we call the Big Bang. Or whether there was anything like the Big Bang is also a question that I raise in that chapter. There's clearly a process of evolution. The universe used to be much more simple. It has a beginning and so on. But there was some continuity from what was before. And this also explains many of the characters. Not only that, but when we are talking about the future, we can say that there are much more human ways of telling stories about the present and the future. Tragic comedy is a case in point, where we can see tragic aspects. There are possibility for collapses. There are all kinds of crises, catastrophes can happen, and so on and so forth. But also, there's a possibility of a very human thing, a happy ending. I mean, it's not never fully happy. I mean, there are new contradictions, new elements of aspiration or desire or whatever. So history will continue to move on. But I mean, nonetheless, we can tell also stories that involve happy endings. And these happy endings also have to do with the cultivation and preservation of life. And this planet is quite unique in the cosmos and in this galaxy. But we might have the task of actually not only protecting and cultivating life on this planet, but even taking life to other parts of the galaxy. So instead of death, we might be seeing the expansion of life, the greening of the galaxy, and new forms of ethics and politics that might evolve with such a project. So we might be in the process of developing new forms of self-consciousness for the cosmos itself. So that's a very different kind of a cosmic story, and it is still totally compatible with modern science. In fact, I argue in chapter 4 that it is more compatible with science, because the first science is reductionist, so it's basically across with only certain interpretations of physics, etc., whereas the latter is also compatible with what we know about life and society. I hope this clarifies a bit. It's a long, complicated story.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Yeah.
Now I
Randhir,
request
can
Minati to offer vote of thanks.
Thank you. I, Minati Pradhan, on behalf of 𝚒𝚗𝚎𝚎𝚗𝚗𝚐𝚕𝚊𝚛 and Vishwaneedam Center for Asian Blossoming, would like to thank today's our chief speaker, Professor